Today, thousands of Christian families have chosen to homeschool their children, fearing the secularizing influences of the public schools. Sometimes these parents have run into trouble with the public school authorities.
I remember a situation in probate court where a family was taken to court and parents were prosecuted for educationally neglecting their children, was the charge. And we showed up at court for a pretrial, and I walk into this room. Usually a pretrial is just the prosecutor and yourself, and you're sitting down trying to resolve a case. And I walk into this room, and it's the county commissioner room, and there's 15, 16 people all around the table. Everybody from the superintendent of the whole school district, assistant superintendents and principals, the prosecutor, protective services workers. It was really quite amazing. I walked into the room, here are all these people. I sit down. They start immediately trying to get me to agree that my clients will plead guilty, and here's what they're going to do in their benevolence, to be nice to my people, and they won't throw them in jail and those kinds of things. And as we started talking, and I told them, well, that wasn't going to happen. We were going to have a trial, and it started getting a little heated. The superintendent was sitting right across the table from me, and he was being quite antagonistic through this meeting. So finally I looked at him and I said, well, sir, if you hadn't arrested my client for simply coming to the school to pick up her children because they had a family emergency, which is what occurred, and that's what precipitated my client starting the homeschooling. I said, if you hadn't arrested her for coming to get her children, maybe we wouldn't be sitting here today. And, he got very angry, and he leaned across the table, pointed his finger right in my face, and he said, when those children cross the schoolhouse door, they're mine. The parents have nothing to say about it. I control everything.
Homeschooling parents who have run into trouble with the authorities due to the way they have chosen to educate their children help to illustrate a basic point. For God intends human societies to consist of millions of individuals and a government that unites all these millions under a system of laws. But we must not stop there. There is more, much more. In between us as individuals and an entire society and its government, there are a host of other institutions and organizations. Think of various clubs and associations, of charitable organizations offering help to those in need, of sports leagues, and most importantly, because they have been explicitly established by God, think of the family and the church. All these institutions and organizations make up what is usually called civil society. When the government interferes with parents who are homeschooling their children, it is interfering with a civil society institution, the family, that has been given as much responsibility and the freedom to carry out that responsibility by God Himself.
To understand the importance of civil society and God's intent for human societies, it is helpful to go back 100 years to a Dutch pastor, writer, and politician. An idea he called sphere sovereignty is still helpful to us today.
Well, Abraham Kuyper was a multi-talented, very energetic, resourceful man who was born around 1840 in the Netherlands and died in 1920. Kuyper thought that human life fell into discrete spheres or we might call domains of activity or fields of activity. We are by nature, by our created being, we are naturally religious people, we are naturally economic people, we are naturally knowledge searchers, we're naturally artistic people. So Kuyper was very fearful that with the example of a right-wing government such as existed at that time in Germany, or a left-wing government, such as in that day existed in France, that from either side, governments were way too tempted, way too inclined to intrude in these domains of human behavior where the governments have no competency and really no business going. I mean, government doesn't know how to teach your kid, government doesn't know how to run a lab, government doesn't know how to draw a painting. And so he wanted these various domains to remain as autonomous or to have as much sovereignty as possible.
In 1891, Pope Leo XIII issued an encyclical in which he discussed what he termed subsidiarity. This idea continues to play a key role in Catholic social thought and is basically similar to Abraham Kuyper's idea of sphere sovereignty.
but the principle of solidarity is closely connected to the principle of subsidiarity, where the idea is that we have an individual responsibility and obligation. Rugged individuals are fine as long as those rugged individuals care for others. And the notion really is that we have a positive obligation to help others, especially others in need, most especially the poor. That's the solidarity concept, serving the common good. But at the same time, we need to do that as individuals, as sort of close to home as possible. So, beginning with the family, beginning with civil institutions, reaching out to family networks, local institutions, civic associations, local government, state government, but in the end, to serve the needs of others, to honor that commitment to the common good, and especially honoring the poor, we need to call upon larger communities if and as necessary, never relieving the individual of the responsibility to transact those social obligations, but at the same time being ready, willing, and able to go to ever larger communities to serve the common good, especially to serve the common good of people in need, from the unborn to the unemployed, and virtually anyone else who may have any particular needs that could be met by those around them.
What the Catholic tradition has called subsidiarity, and what the Protestant Abraham Kuyper and his followers have called sphere sovereignty, contain the same basic kernel, namely, that there are civil society institutions, such as the family, the church, and voluntary organizations, that have as much right to exist as does government. Both government and civil society are a part of God's will for society. Both have God-intended roles to play. This insight has enormous practical implications for public policy. It means government's public policies ought to respect and make room for civil society institutions and the good they are doing, not ignore them, and surely not undercut them or try to take over for them. This is an insight that both liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans often miss.
So I don't think it's conservative or liberal. It's just our basic need.
I find myself saying that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. It's probably not a conservative idea or a liberal idea. I think there's probably a combination of both ideologies that are going to be effective in that area.
Well, if you're a liberal, you're going to have a problem with subsidiarity. If you're a conservative, you're going to have a problem with subsidiarity because it depends on which side of the subsidiarity coin you're looking at. If you're very much concerned about government having too much responsibility and being too big, there's something in subsidiarity for you because the principle tells you always deliver the care at the unit of society, starting with the individual through church groups, as close as possible to the person or people in need, not letting government usurp that responsibility. So on the one hand. On the other hand, if you're a liberal, you're going to feel a bit like government is the enemy when you look at subsidiarity. You're going to find that it's giving you this sort of bright line test saying you should always try to keep the charity a local call, not make it a long distance call. Yet at the same time, you're going to see subsidiarity saying, well, but if you come up against a big social problem, a big social ill that individuals and church groups and so forth cannot meet on their own, then you have a positive moral obligation to make that long distance call and to involve larger communities up to and including the national political community represented by our democratic government in Washington, D.C.
I kind of lean towards thinking that civil society and organizations like, nonprofits, whatever, do sometimes a much, much, much better job than the government could ever do in taking care of our society. And where the slippery slope comes in then is, well, okay, should the government then jump in and start helping to fund some of these things to allow them to do what they do rather than the government having to spend, whether us, suddenly essentially putting our tax dollars into some big hole that that could go anywhere. And then is the government going to be dictating to these charities and these organizations how that money is spent?
Yeah, I think it's also dangerous to think in terms of just nonprofits. We need to remember the family and the church and other just friendships and loose relationships that way. And I think it's just a very modern thing when we start to think in terms of organization and fundraising and the mechanisms of organizations. I think that's maybe losing some of the biblical perspective. I didn't see Moses with his 501c3 organizing the the relief of the Israelites.